more about this brain learning thing. Learning increases blood flow to the brain. Maybe that's the amount of blood flow we're actually supposed to have in our brain, but we don't because we're not learning. And then the brain starts deteriorating. I actually feel like since Sandra Bond Chapman said that big ideas are very important for the brain, that maybe I can share some even weirder stuff as my brain goes there. I have weirder stuff written down in my notebooks probably, but I haven't even gotten there. And it's hard to go backwards because I write so much in current time. And again, it's not about the ideas, it's about if I would wish anything for somebody else, it would be to be restored to learning. Our brains are wanting to learn again, and we're told to fear our own brains. We're told that our brains are defective. And you can go on TED and listen to so many talks on neuroplasticity saying people who seem doomed with worse afflictions can get their brain functionality back. It's very plastic. So to think it can be damaged, to me, seems like a ridiculous notion. I feel like what's more important is to join with other brains and consciousness in order to have this flower into a different awareness, not an awareness of being some kind of defective person, but an awareness that the brain is trying to come back online. And is trying to learn. And it's trying to come back online so we cooperate together and we take care of each other. I feel like in each crisis, so-called crisis or episode, the brain is trying to learn how to take more perspectives. It's given me the experience of feeling like a homeless person. Maybe so I know what it feels like to be a homeless person. And it makes sense that it would do that in order for us to be able to empathize with each other and not judge each other and understand each other and help each other more. I feel like each episode of so-called psychosis is like the brain doing weightlifting. It's a hyper-learning state. Even if it's terrifying or even if it's magical, it's hyper-learning. It's new. It's something different than we're used to. So it's going to make the brain grow, not shrink. It's shrinking away from all that we used to think was important and meaningful. And that part of the brain goes offline somewhat. And then we're seen as mentally ill because we don't subscribe to the meanings of society that we've been given and tricked into thinking that are what matters in life. And then the double whammy is that we get tricked into thinking that we are defective. And everything outside of our regular mode of perception is slightly confusing. It's uncharted territory. And each episode helps us learn to navigate that confusion. And confusion is necessary for growth. If we're never confused, that could be a problem, because then we're just knowing everything all the time. And if we're only knowing, we're not open and curious. Being confused like that could actually provide a rich opportunity for learning. And it could be partly that we see that our thoughts are confusing. We confuse our thoughts with reality. And we're not only doing that in psychosis, we're doing that in regular consciousness. And those thoughts are telling us what is important and what is meaningful and what we want. But that's not in alignment with the universe. That's not in alignment with humanity. And so the universe comes in and tries to erase a lot of what we think is meaningful in life. And we often feel very connected with other meanings. And then when we come back to this meaningless reality, we're told that all of that just means we're mentally ill. When that's why I feel like harvesting one's mania and practicing and embodying is important. To do strength training, it's almost like we're given a blueprint in our brain, a blueprint of neurons for other territory and other meanings and other ways of being, and we can still recall those and go back there consciously without having to have the confusion. And I feel like that state is the mind. It's the collective mind, and it's showing us, it's trying to change our brain so we'll create a different world. A world that we all want. Even people who would pathologize us would want this other world. And we're here to create that world together. We're here to create a world where everybody lives in harmony, not where people kill each other. Does that seem like such an unreasonable thing to think? I think if somebody is never confused, if somebody never has a change in consciousness, then one isn't learning. One is more like a drone. So-called psychosis could be transconscious brain growth. When the brain goes up to different levels of consciousness, it grows. And it makes sense that the brain cells would get scared when it's coming back down to other levels of reality. I feel like the brain is having a growth spurt. And just like growth spurts physically can be painful, so can brain consciousness growth spurts. So I would like to put forth the idea of the brain growth theory of so-called psychosis. And it's like a form of sensory substitution. We're less sensing our ego structure that is a false structure that we've been given, that we've been conditioned with, and we're more sensing our sensitivity, we're more perceptive. And in the society we've designed, it's actually not good to be that perceptive, as we see, because people who go into that form of perception, I think it actually damages the prefrontal cortex, because one sees how damaging the prefrontal cortex is, in that what it has created for us collectively as humans isn't something we would design if we were in our right minds. And so a lot of it is recovery from society, and part of that is creating a new society. Who knows how to even go about that? But I think that people who go through trance consciousness would have a good idea of how to design a better society. And we might have to start with nothing, with no money. We don't have money anyway. We're defective according to society. But I feel like we could create a society that regular society would be wishing they could come and experience. And they talk about mental illness as having brain damage, and it gets worse over time. I think society is what damages the brain. So if it gets worse over time, it's that somebody that's hyper-perceptive is dipped in the poison of society, and over time they're seeing more and more traumatic things, and it is damaging their brains. And then the very paradigm designed to supposedly help just facilitates that process. The ego perspective gets damaged, but we are given infinite perspectives and that isn't damaged. And it's not allowed to flower because we're actually not talking about all the perspectives that we've seen. We're not talking about our visions. We're not talking about our perception. We're not talking about our altruistic nature. People who pathologize us don't understand who we are in the heart. They're so busy looking at other things. They can't even see what we've seen. And then we come back here and we can't even tell people what we've seen. But at least if we can talk to each other, then maybe we'll create enough brain cells in each of our brains to protect us from pathologizing ourselves by taking somebody else's voice who's told us how to think about ourselves after all of that and turning it into a label. Society is not designed for infinite learning. It's designed to be a drone, to be a robot. And recovery is about going back to just being a robot. I feel like map consciousness is perhaps a desperate attempt by the brain to restart itself, because all that one values in their ego process is false. And a lot of times that happens through trauma, and then the ego process falls apart, and then one has access to trans consciousness when the ego structure sees that what it's really valued has led it nowhere at all. And something happens where there's extra oxygen to the brain, and then the brain can learn. It's almost like the ego steals all the brain's oxygen. And I talked about in previous videos about how it wastes energy. And it could actually be that the prefrontal cortex is taking all the oxygen electrons, all the negative charge into the prefrontal cortex, and the other areas of the brain can't grow. So when we no longer identify with that, then our brains can learn. And it's interesting that it feels spiritual, because learning feels spiritual. And in terms of learning, well, what do we need to learn? I think it goes back to things like cooperation. I don't know how. And I think map consciousness tries to recalibrate the brain and body to cooperate. Our brain is in service of our ego, and it's not listening to our body, and it's not listening to the fundamental laws of human nature either. And I have this sense that what we're looking for is actually our own brain, our own unclouded brain. But how do we look for that with a clouded brain? We're clouding the very thing we're looking for. We're clouding the very thing we're looking with. It's just clouded with a bunch of words. And I was thinking about medication and how it probably stops brain growth, probably stops oxygenation to the brain properly, and it stops people from thinking for themselves. And I feel like map consciousness is the brain or the mind trying to get the brain back interested in itself. Because if it doesn't become interested in itself and its own ability to learn, instead of just earning and pleasure in things, it's degrading. So map consciousness comes in and tries to make life interesting, tries to make it meaningful, tries to make it a different game. And all of a sudden, one is interested in learning because one finds every little thing interesting. And it's so powerful. Like, how could we not be so fascinated by that process? Even in retrospect after it stopped, but most of us aren't. We're like, wow, that was too scary. I'm just gonna drug myself and say don't stigmatize me and consider myself a less than person. And it's not about mental illness. us. It's about thought, old thoughts, habitual thoughts. And that's what degrades the brain. And then sometimes people get to the point where they have odd thoughts. But I think it's actually part of the process of getting out of the habit of thoughts that normally we are stuck in. And it's almost like the light of our vision has been turned into sound. So if a person has a quiet mind with no words in it, it's just silent, there's just light. And then whatever one sees can sort of speak to the person. But if we're speaking to ourselves, we're obstructing the light of our vision. And we can't really see. And so we've turned our light, we've turned our vision into sound that creates other images that gets in the way. We're projecting. We're all living in a world of our own projection. We're projecting our own voice. And we're being used by it. We're not using it. We've been taught to be used by our own voice instead of actually using it. And we're perhaps to use it to learn, not to judge and argue and actually solidify our separateness and solidify our positionalities and solidify our opinions. Most of our opinions we heard from somebody else. And then we translate it into our own voice and then we think it's our opinion. But it's actually just programming, and then we're turned into minions. I feel like I need to grow into my own brain blueprint. It's like I was given a blueprint when I went into map consciousness that very first time especially. And it grew some brain cells that if other people grew those brain cells, that would be the world. But people have these limited separate brains. The map consciousness gives us a map for learning. It's not about those specific experiences, it's about the learning process itself. It's an invitation to think for ourselves about things because that was our own inner experience. Nobody else had that experience exactly. People can't deny your inner experience. You could think about your inner experience however you want to. And according to that TED Talk, the bigger you think about things, the more oxygen you're going to have in your brain, the more blood you're going to have in your brain. And watch out, because you might actually get really smart. Part of the trouble actually is that people in regular consciousness with programmed brains don't really understand. So there's not very many people to talk to, because you may as well be talking to a brick wall. So that TED Talk really gave me the motivation to continue with self-dialogue and keep the oxygen going to my brain. So that could be the main point, to keep the extra oxygen going to my brain and keep my brain from shrinking back down to the level of society. The game of reality is dopamine, pleasure seeking, and the universe is erasing this program. So we need to find the new program and get with it, which could be learning, being creative, thinking for ourselves, and thinking together with each other and cooperating. Sounds like a more fun game.